Hello and welcome back to another edition of our weekly Bible readings video. We finish up the book of Romans today, and this is one of the reasons why I like to read the scriptures slowly and take them just a little bit at a time every day, because I feel like we have just whizzed through the book of Romans. 4 weeks, I think, is what it ended up taking. And this is one of those books that I think you could spend several months picking apart and just reading the rich theology, again, as this is more of a systematic theology for Paul. So we're going to have to cover quite a bit today and won't be able to dive in as deeply as I would have liked. But I hope that you'll go back and read more in the book of Romans, that you'll really sit with the book of Romans. It is a very deep and important theological text for us, because it describes exactly what God does for us in saving us and filling us with the Spirit, in moving us not only as individuals but as a community forward into the world to help change the world. And this book is just an amazing, has an amazing impact on our Christian life. So give the book of Romans more time than just 4 weeks, but let's dive in and look at what Paul has to say in these last 5 chapters. If Romans 1 through 8 was Paul's systematic theology for the Gentiles, and then 9 through 11 was Paul's appeal to his Jewish brothers and sisters and the theology of what will happen with them, then chapters 12 and 13 are sort of like Paul's Sermon on the Mount. We get a very broad look at many different aspects of the Christian life in kind of small little sermonettes, in a similar way to what Jesus does in Matthew 5 through 7. And so Paul covers a lot of ground here, but I think this opening statement of his in chapter 12, which we probably know pretty well, defines a lot of what he's going to then explain in a little more detail throughout these chapters. He says, "I appeal to you, therefore, brothers and sisters, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds, so that you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect." And so Paul is basically saying here, in the rest of my letter leading up to this, I have told you where God has brought you and what God has done for you through his grace. Now this is the way that you are called to respond to that grace, to live that grace out in such a way that it shows an act of worship through your behaviors, through your attitudes, that all of the choices then that you make to live out will reflect the things that God has done for you. This is how grace works. Grace changes you. And so again, this is that appeal to sanctification. Don't just receive the grace of God and let it just sit there and be satisfied with your salvation, but put that grace into action and become more like Christ has lived his own life, but also more like God has intended for us since the beginning to live our lives. And so this basic idea of not being conformed to the world, in other words, don't set the pattern for how you live based on how everyone else is living, but instead be transformed by the renewing of your minds. Be transformed by this grace to be something different. We talk about that a lot in our family, in our household, how God has called us to be different. If we just look like the world outside of us, then we're really not pointing the world to a better life or a better hope than what this world can offer. But if we commit to being different by living as Christ lived, by living as God intended, then we can share that grace with other people. So Paul's going to, in chapter 12, really talk about what it's like for the inside of us to change, and then chapter 13, what it's like for the outside of us to change. And so be changed on the inside. It will change who you are on the outside. And it does look different as a Christian to live for Christ than what the rest of the world is doing. So I'm not going to get into the particulars of the rest of chapter 12, but I would sit every day and read chapter 12, verses 9 through 21. 13 verses there. Just read that, and that is how you are to be different. That is talking about the Christian ethic, the Christian moral choice that we're all presented with because of what grace has done in us. And I do think there's one very important thing here that could kind of sum a lot of it up in verse 18, where Paul says, if it is possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. That really defines the Christian ethic. It really is very similar to love thy neighbor, which is another thing I want to point out. In chapter 13, Paul talks about our responsibility to love one another. And he quotes Jesus's quote of the Old Testament in saying, love your neighbor as yourself. What is interesting about this is we don't get a lot of love language from Paul. Now, of course, we do see in 1 Corinthians 13, the love chapter, where Paul talks about the character of love. And of course, Paul has talked about even in chapter 8 of Romans how the love of God for us in Jesus Christ is always available to us. We're never separated from that love. But we generally associate the love language, the language of love God and love one another, or love your neighbor, with both Jesus and then John. John writes extensively about this idea of loving your neighbor, especially in his 3 epistles. So this is a little fresh for Paul, if you're familiar with Paul's other writings. This idea of really honing in on loving your neighbor. But that love of neighbor just goes, to show us that is central to our identity as Christians. That you have Jesus, John, and Paul that are emphasizing this. That this is something that we cannot ignore or cannot neglect if we are going to live out the Christian ethic. You must love your neighbor. One interesting thing that Paul incorporates here into the Christian ethic in chapter 13 is this appeal to follow the authorities, the civic authorities in the world. And he actually connects them to God, that they have their authority because of God. Now, we may struggle with that a little bit. Think of people like Vladimir Putin, or even think back a little more in history. Think of someone like Joseph Stalin or Adolf Hitler, and we would think there's no way that they have their authority because God granted them that authority. Because obviously what they did not reflect anything about what God has called us to be and do. Their leadership was nothing like the leadership of Christ. But I think what Paul is saying here is that the ultimate authority in the cosmos belongs to God. And so there is no authority that is greater than the authority that God has. And so all authority ultimately belongs to Him. And so I think there's even really a countercultural message in this. And I think Paul's saying basically, let them have their authority because they don't really have any authority. Their authority is going to fall. Their authority is not going to ultimately, be eternal. But that God's going to have authority even after leaders rise and fall. But Paul is definitely saying, and he's explicitly saying right here, that you should be subject to the governing authorities. That's in the very first verse of chapter 13. So how do we deal with this as Christian citizens when authorities ask us perhaps to do things that are against the Christian ethic? Is there a place for civil disobedience in the Christian life? And I think Paul's life itself answers that question. Paul is saying be subject to the governing authorities, but never to the point where your subjection to them would put your subjection or submission to God in danger. And Paul is a witness to this in the fact that he is martyred by the civic authorities. He is beheaded, he is killed because he ultimately will not submit to their plan for him. And so Paul, I think, here is saying two things. He's saying the part about God has the ultimate authority, and he is saying that it is the Christian's responsibility to be a good citizen, so far as being a good citizen honors God. If there is something about citizenship on earth that is at odds with citizenship in heaven, you always choose your citizenship in heaven. In chapter 14, Paul begins to close this letter by emphasizing how important we are to one another and to one another's faith. Back in chapter 12, he gave a little explanation of something that he gets more deeply into in his letters to the Corinthians, but where he talks about how the body is made up of many members and we all have different gifts. And basically the idea is those members are supposed to build one another up, not tear one another down. And he picks up on that theme even more strongly in chapter 14, where Paul basically says, don't do anything in your freedom to make another believer stumble. So for instance, he uses this very real challenge that they were having in this time, in this age, about whether or not to eat certain foods based on whether or not they were sacrificed to idols. We've seen this in other books that we looked at from the New Testament as well. And Paul's basically saying, if you who have the freedom to do whatever you are called to do in Christ, if you do something that is going to make your brother or sister stumble or doubt their faith or weaken their faith, it's not worth it, even if you are free to do it. That basically you need to act out the Christian ethic in such a way that you encourage the faith of other people. I think of this in a situation such as, let's say, smoking. Smoking is in no way prohibited by the Bible. We don't even know if they knew anything about tobacco in that time period. But smoking is not a sin. Smoking is not good for you. It's not good for your health. We definitely have seen that smoking not only affects your health, but it can affect other people's health. And so a lot of places nowadays, in fact almost every indoor place that you go to, prohibits smoking. When I was a kid, when you were younger, I'm sure it was the same way. You had smoking and non-smoking sections, or you just were able to smoke anywhere. But they realized that that secondhand smoke was bad for people who were not involved in the actual smoking of tobacco. And in the same sense here, Paul is saying you may be free to smoke, but if your smoking is going to hurt brother A and sister B over here, it's not worth doing, because you don't want to use your freedom to cause somebody else to stumble, to doubt their faith, those types of things. So we need to have that attitude of building one another up, not doing things that are going to tempt others, not doing things that are going to weaken one another's faith, and definitely not tearing one another down. Build each other up, because you need one another in the church to do the work of God. Basically what Paul is talking about here is that idea of mutuality, which we've spoken about so many times before, and that he really focuses in on in the book of Philippians. But it's so central to who we are as Christians, that we don't live just for ourselves, but we are called to love one another, to empty ourselves so that others might be lifted up to Christ. And it's that old adage that the high tide lifts all ships. And that's what we're doing when we raise one brother or sister up. We're raising the whole church up, and we're really raising ourselves up. So be a person of mutuality. Serve other people. Love them so that they might experience the fullness of God's love. Use what God has given you to edify other people. It's interesting to me here that Paul talks about wanting to visit the Romans on his way to Spain. That just seems very, kind of out of the biblical world. Of course, the world that Paul's living in of the Roman Empire at that time stretched all the way up to Great Britain, or what we think of as Great Britain now. So the world was, I think, a lot bigger than we think it was back then. But there's just something to me that's exotic and exciting about Paul talking about wanting to go to Spain. We don't have any proof that Paul ever made it to Spain, because unfortunately when he makes it to Rome, it's as a prisoner, and his journey ends in Rome through martyrdom. But it shows us here that Paul really wanted to stretch the boundaries of the church. And he speaks about not going and preaching in places where other people had done the work of preaching and establishing the church. I think sometimes we as Christians today forget that there are still lots of people around us who have never heard the gospel, and that we need to stretch the boundaries of the church, that we don't just exist for ourselves. We talk about that missional attitude of the church. That's what this is. is that we'd be willing to go to far off Spain if it meant that we could win new converts to the kingdom of God. Well, we may not have to go to Spain. We may just have to cross the street, or we may have to talk to somebody that we don't know that we encounter in the community. Because, whichever way you want to look at it, unfortunately, America as a culture is not, foundationally Christian now, if it ever really was. I mean, we need to bring people to a greater awareness of Jesus Christ. There are people in our own community who have gone their whole lives without an awareness of Jesus Christ. So be missional. Reach out to your community. Reach out if it's at Dollar General or if it's at Freshway, wherever it's at. Reach out and be that witness to the love of God. Finally, in chapter 16, we see Paul give greetings to people who are in the church in Rome that he knows already. We see our old friends Priscilla and Aquila from the book of Acts. We see a lot of names that sound very Latin to show that there were, the church had made it all the way into Rome, into Latin Gentile Rome, and that people were embracing the gospel. But one thing that I think is very interesting is the presence of women in these greetings, and especially the fact that he calls Phoebe a deacon, and he also calls Junia or Junius, it depends on which translation you have, calls her an apostle. And this shows that even in the early church, women had important leadership roles. And so for a woman to be called a deacon, a woman to be called an apostle, that's very significant. And it shows that the early church found a place for talented, spiritual, anointed women to serve in leadership. And so you see several other women who appear in these greetings. Again, we've mentioned it other times in reading Paul's writings, but God definitely had an important place for women in the leadership of the church from the very beginning. It shows a great cloud of witnesses that already existed there in Rome, and we can see why Paul wanted to visit and just touch base with them and connect with them. And it reminds us again of how important we are as the church to one another. I think in these last 5 chapters, what Paul is saying is that if we want to live out the grace that God has given us, then we have to live it out in the community of the church. That we can't do it on ourselves, that we have a great responsibility to one another to help us live out the Christian ethic. So build one another up this week, and next week we'll start in the book of Hebrews. We'll see this systematic gospel to the Jews and understand how they were to be grafted into the church. Have a great week, and I'll see you soon. God bless.